Well, welcome everybody. We're really glad to have you with us this evening. My name is Chris Redfern. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of the Middlesex Fells Reservation. And if you're not familiar with our organization, the Friends of the Fells is dedicated to the protection and basically the harmonious use of the fells. We try to promote awareness about the value of the fells biologically. We work on policies and programs to help honor and preserve the ecological, historical, and recreational resources that the fells provides all of us in the community surrounding that special space. And tonight we're fortunate to be able to spend some time with Dr. Randi Rotjan, and who's waving now. Randi's a professional marine ecologist, so you might wonder, why is she going to talk to us about plants? I guess plants are in the ocean, right, Randi? But the reason actually is because Randi, in addition to being a professional marine ecologist and a professor at Boston University, she happens to be a board member on our board of directors at the Friends of the Fells. And she happens to have a great passion for the fells, having lived really nearby, and has gotten her fingers in the soil, right, Randi? Transforming her own personal space nearby the fells to have it benefit the wildlife and the habitats that we love and cherish there at the Middlesex Fells. I'm going to give it to Randi, and this is going to be really informal. If you have a question, I'm going to be checking the chat box to look for questions, and Randi loves to be interrupted. So this can be nice and free form. And so if you have a question in the middle of the presentation, please just type it into the chat box. Randi, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Hopefully you'll meet my cute smiley 5-year-old and not a screaming one during this seminar if you meet him at all. But I am really excited to be here. Thank you, Chris, again, for that lovely introduction, albeit interrupted. My apologies. And I have lived in Medford for 16 years, and I just recently moved, but I lived at the border of the Fells, and the Fells has always been a really special place in my heart. And I'm sure for those of you who are here, it's a special place in yours too, or it's only recently maybe become so because everybody has been using nature in a way that we don't often have time to access, right? And I think it's really important. And so I don't know about you, but the first time, I'm a biologist, so I want to put a name on everything. I want to, get a species ID on everything that's out there. And when I first started walking in the woods a lot, I knew my basic maples, oaks, birches, beech trees kind of thing. But the more I learned, the more I was horrified when I realized how much of nature isn't natural anymore. Mostly at the edges, right? As you go into the interior of the forest, it gets more and more native plants. But I'm a biologist, and I became more and more interested in what was going on around me, and realizing that the more I knew, the more I had to act. And even though I'm a marine biologist who thinks about conservation and marine conservation on the other side of the world most of the time, I really strongly felt compelled to do something in my own backyard and to do this for the forest, but also for the ocean. And so let me explain what I mean by that. And hopefully this will work. Chris, I think, can you tell me if we're having technical difficulties? That would be terrible. There we go. Okay, so hopefully this will shift for you guys too. But for me, all paths lead to the ocean. I mean, they really lead to the ocean. My entire professional career is spent either on or underwater, thinking about ocean creatures, mostly in the far-flung Pacific, a little bit here in the Atlantic. I work in a large-scale marine protected area. I'm the co-chief scientist on the other side of the globe. And when I think about what happens in the ocean, it took me a while to realize that what happens in the ocean and many of the problems that are happening in the ocean really start on land. And sometimes it's quite literal. All paths really do lead to the ocean. I mean, you guys have seen these signs all over the place, right? Don't dump, it drains to X or Y river. And that's not just a cute little sign. those are really important. And, it's a funny thing to see, because the first time I saw a sign like that, I had this image of, like, the Joker from Batman, sitting there, cackling maniacally, pouring this toxic green chemical waste down into the river and going, ha ha, I will poison the water supply of, whatever town. But that doesn't happen anymore, right? Thanks to lots of really great regulation. But what does happen is exactly what you see here, and what's happening on a rainy day like today, right? Water is rushing over lawns, and it's going into the street and off of our sidewalks, and it's going down storm drains. And those storm drains don't get filtered. They go straight to the ocean. So if you care about what goes into the ocean, and I do, and hopefully you guys do too if you love the beach, then you have to care about what's happening on land. And if you care about what's happening on land, you have to care about what's happening on our lawns and on our properties, because we live in really highly dense urbanized areas where this matters a whole lot. And so when I take students down to the Boston Harbor and I say, hey, what influences coastal marine organisms? What's going on in the Boston Harbor? How do we fix it? First day of class, I take students down to the harbor and I ask that question, and all they do is look at the ocean. And then halfway through my lecture, I'm like, turn around, people, wrong direction. Time to go back on land. And that's what leads me to the Fells. It's this idea of taking a watershed perspective. And a watershed, right, is just an area where all the water that falls in that area drains through a specific waterway. And so this can be precipitation, it can be, infiltrating groundwater, it can be river streams, etc. And we, I love this map, right? It gives you new respect for the Mississippi River watershed. We'd hate to be an oyster living like right here. But in New England, or at least in Boston, right, there are 3 rivers which drain to the Boston Harbor. There's 3 watersheds. One is the Mystic River watershed, one is the Neponset, one is the Charles. And the Fells happen to sit as the major green space in the Mystic River watershed, right? The Middlesex Fells are right in the middle of all of this. And what water falls in the Middlesex Fells gets filtered in the Middlesex Fells and then runs right out to the oceans. So, and you can see all the different towns, right? There's, I think, 21 different municipalities which are influenced by the Mystic River watershed. And here's the Fells right in the center of it. Okay. Outlined in red, hopefully in a second for you guys. There's a lag. Okay, so we're here, of course, because we're all interested in the Fells, and here I am talking about the ocean, but hopefully I've convinced you guys that my 2 interests connect. And I will just say one more thing about that, which, as I learn more and more and more about sort of the different terrestrial conservation agendas, at first I was like, oh God, my heart is going to be split, do this for the ocean and do this for the land. But in actuality, all of these conservation initiatives are aligned. What you do for the ocean also helps the terrestrial world, and what you do for the terrestrial world also helps the ocean. So these things are connected in many, 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 many different ways. Okay, so here's a little map of the Fells. As I was saying, they're highly urbanized. This is actually one of the largest urban forests in the world. The population density surrounding the Middlesex Fells is astounding. I mean, I haven't tabulated it, but there's well over 1 million people who live within very close proximity to the Middlesex Fells. And there's 21 municipalities and 76 square miles. This is in the Mystic River watershed, right? And there are 7 or 8 towns listed here, but there's 21 total town cities. And if you look at a Google map, all you'll see is pavement surrounding the Fells. And so there's this little island. Think of the Fells as an island for native plants and animals, and that's all they have. Because when they leave that island, they're on the busy city streets of Medford, or Malden, or Melrose, or Winchester, right? I mean, Stoneham. If you're a bee or a butterfly and you fly out of this forest, you're going to find yourself with a car whizzing by and in somebody's backyard. So the Middlesex Fells are an island and surrounded by high urban density. And so what we do in our yards really, really matters. Now it's spring, right? And late spring at this point. And you guys have probably all seen this cast of characters at some point in the past month or so, right? You've seen daffodils, you've seen lily of the valley, you've seen Bradford pears, you've seen tulips. If you're like me, you've celebrated the fact that they exist and they're flowering and they smell good and the weather is turning. And this year you probably celebrated it more than ever because it meant we could go outside. And that's all wonderful. And none of these species are native. That's okay. I like ornamental gardens. That's fine to some extent. But Some of these plants, two in particular, are invasive, which means that they can escape to the forest and start displacing native plants. And that's one problem. And one of the other problems is that for all of these, even the beautiful ornamentals that just stay put and don't invade the forest and don't do anything bad and stay where in your garden and they're pretty well behaved, they offer literally nothing to wildlife. No insect can use them as a host plant to lay their eggs on, and they don't offer much food compared to native alternatives. And so can you imagine celebrating any less if instead of daffodils, you had trout lilies, or instead of lily of the valley, you had Canada Mayflower? I mean, this is like one of the most stunning and ubiquitous plants all around New England. I love it. And I would not celebrate this any less. In fact, I celebrate it even more once you understand the wildlife value of these plants, right? You know, chokecherry and wild cherries and all these other things which can kind of look similar and have this beautiful floral scent. You can have trilliums instead of tulips. I mean, there are some great options out there. All 4 of the plants on your screen right now are native, and they offer huge benefits to wildlife. And they are just as stunning, if not more. And you know, you won't have the same old vanilla garden as everybody else. Instead of tulips, you'll have trillium. I mean, that's pretty cool. So, I mean, the list is endless, right? When I walk in the spring, you guys probably celebrated red buds, right? But it's a native plant. They're gorgeous, first pop of color in the spring. And bloodroot, you know, one of the first flowers to open. And witch hazel, which has the, you know, the chutzpah to flower in February. I mean, this plant deserves some respect. And Jack in the Pulpit, as you have in the bottom right, which looks like poison ivy, but makes your head cock because it doesn't really. And then you get closer and you realize that it's this incredibly cool flower with, it almost looks like a little secret flower tucked underneath. So there are some amazing options. And all of these plants live naturally in the Middlesex Fells. And what the problem is that what we put in our gardens escapes to the fells and hurts them. But if we put in our gardens was the same stuff, we could bolster their populations. And that is what I'm here to talk about. So for example, many cities, and this is not local to here, this is just everywhere, right? I don't know who decided that Bradford pears were the most exciting street tree in the world, but somebody made this executive decision, and lo and behold, most of the street trees that you see are like ginkgo or Bradford pear, like in the vast majority of the area. And you know, they open up and they have this sort of, some people think their smell stinks, people think it's beautiful. I'm not going to weigh in on that debate, but they are a surefire sign of spring. You want to celebrate them, except that they march into the forest. And no, they're not, you know, Ents from Lord of the Rings. They don't grow, you know, roots in March, but they spread seeds, right, which are helped to be spread by the birds and end up displacing native plants. And these street trees are terrible at standing up straight. This is actually my house in Medford, and we had a Bradford pear street tree, and it fell on my house. And I was shocked until I looked at the root system of this thing. I mean, take a look. This is not a deep root system, right? So this is what this plant has to keep itself up. Of course it's going to fall down. So there are lots of cities around here, Medford being one of them, who have slowly started to change the tree species that they use from Bradford pears to at least more stable, if not native, which is wonderful. But it's this recognition that one plant is not the same as another plant, right? And they do different things for the ecosystem, and they have more or less stability for where you want them to be. So there are beautiful native options. I know some of you will miss your Bradford pears, but I promise you won't celebrate a redbud any less. You'll be thrilled for it. This is what I'm talking about. This is coming up in a second, you'll see this gorgeous redbud. Heart-shaped leaves, beautiful purple flowers, smells great, right? They're really good native alternatives. So the other reason to care about this, and then we'll get into the logistics of sort of some of the science behind this and then what you can actually do in your yard. But the other reason to think about this is the importance of what the fells means for all of us. And I think that this importance would have needed to be said really differently a few months ago, but I think now it's really clear to all of us, right, that clean air and a space to roam are really important. I think the pandemic has brought that into crystal clear focus for all of us. And the fells are an interesting forest because if you take a look, right, Highway 93 cuts right through the center of it. And you see this right and left half, and it almost looks like a pair of lungs or a pair of human kidneys. And both are appropriate, right? Because the fells is a forest, which means that, you know, every single spring and summer, right, when the trees leaf out and everything kind of comes to life, it cleans our air for us, right? These plants are sequestering carbon dioxide and fixing carbon, and they're just improving our air quality in a million different ways, not to mention all the other things that they do, right? Like improving our soil quality and helping water get to the water table and filtering that, right? So lots of things. So they're doing a great job as lungs in helping us breathe, and they're also doing a great job as kidneys in helping us filter, right? And they're helping us clean up natural pollutants in our environment. So the forest is both a set of lungs and a set of kidneys, and we have a forest that looks like it. How lucky are we? So great. The other thing I was going to show you is this really cool, very simple animation that just sort of shows you how the world breathes every single year. And this is, really obvious, right? We've all gone from winter to spring to summer to fall a million times. But when you think about it from a global carbon budget perspective, I hope this works. And can you guys see that? I hope. Okay, and you guys can watch the world breathe. It really drives home for me how important the Northern Hemisphere is, right? There's much more forested land there, and it is vitally important. And so the more carbon that we capture every single season, the better it is for the whole entire world all the time, right? This is part of the carbon equation. Okay, speaking of carbon, just to put this in, give everyone the absolute latest numbers, right? This is sort of the full record of the Keeling curve, which is where they measure carbon dioxide concentration on the peaks of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and have been since the mid 1960s. Can't speak. I think it's in the early 1960s or mid 1950s, something like that. So they've been reading this record for a long time now, and we passed 400 parts per million in 2014, and the mere 6 years since, right, we're now up to 416.76. This is a lot. And, what we're all trying to do is keep carbon emissions below 425. We're getting close. And so what we do in our forests, in our backyards, is part of the whole carbon emissions, carbon sequestration, carbon budget piece that we're all trying to solve at the same time. In addition to caring about carbon and forests breathing and plants, which I love, you might also care about insects. And for those of you who know what this is, you might kind of just go, oh, yuck. But it's a sign of my childhood, right? I remember going on road trips with my parents and them having to stop on the side of the road and pull out a windshield wiper and wipe the bugs off of the windshield so that they could see, and then keep driving. And then a few hours later, if we went on a long road trip, right, have to stop and do it again. And so what you're looking at right now is the windshield of a car covered in bugs. This view is not that common anymore. Granted, we all live in a city, right? Or near cities, I assume, but it's still not that common. And a couple of years ago, a paper came out in Science, and there are a bunch of other things talking about where have all the insects gone. And you might have seen the news stories, insect apocalypse, is it really coming? It's been kind of controversial, actually. But remember that insects are critical. We need them for pollination. We need them for lots of other things. And they're an essential part of our ecosystem. They're a huge part of the food web, right? They feed birds and they feed herps and a lot of other things that we really care about. Small mammals, and in many ways, right, through the food chain, they're at the base of the food chain. And so the loss of insects could be really scary. So the decline is happening quickly. We're losing beetles and ants and butterflies and dragonflies and grasshoppers, most of all, right? We're losing them quickly and very intensively, and it's happening over the period of, we're now talking about decades. We're not talking about hundreds of years or thousands of years. I mean, this is our lifetime. So if you take a look at the grams of insects collected in seed traps between 1989 and 2013 at the same locations, you will note a dramatic loss of insect decline. And when this paper first came out, the world freaked out and said, oh my God, this is terrible. And then there was a lot of controversy. And a new paper came out just a month ago in Science. So this is absolutely the laser cutting edge of what we know. And it was a huge survey. It's Van Klink et al. It was published on April 24th in Science. And they used data from 166 long-term surveys with 1,676 globally distributed sites. And this is the largest sort of meta-analysis ever taken on the status of our insects. And what turns out is that terrestrial fauna, as you'll see on the top graph, right, there's a lot of red and pink dots on there. Those are all in decline. But interestingly, freshwater fauna, right? So things like water striders, right? So freshwater associated insects seem to be on the rise. And if you break this down to different parts of the world and different sorts of things, I'll show you how to read this graph. So on the left side, you'll see what they're measuring, so abundance and biomass. Here you have different parts of the world, Europe, North America, Asia, etc. And then on the bottom in panel C, you'll have different types of habitats, so temperate or tropical, for example. And then the way you read this is that the center line at 0, if it's below 0, so if it's to the left, it's declining. If it's to the right of 0, it's increasing. And then inside these parentheses, what you'll see is the number of studies on the left and the number of sites on the right, each underlying each estimate. Okay, so this is a pretty complicated graph, but it does a pretty good job of showing you that there's a whole lot of brown to the left and a whole lot of blue to the right. And the brown on the left represents the decline of terrestrial insects the world over, especially in North America, and the rise of freshwater insects the world over. So are we in an insect apocalypse? It depends which kind of insects you're talking about. But certainly if you're a terrestrial insect, which is what most of the forest insects are, this doesn't bode well. If you look at North America in particular, now the 0 is just flipped. So if you're on the bottom of this dashed line, you're declining. And if you're on the top of this dashed line, it's an increase. You can see that this trend is true all throughout North America and the globe. But North America is is one of the most clear trends and is driving the global distribution. Finally, whether or not a place is protected or not doesn't seem to matter, which is a little unfortunate. But it might matter a little bit. We just don't have as many protected places that we're studying. So the protection status, in this case, there's slightly more or less loss in protected terrestrial insects than in non-protected. So this is a problem. We're losing our terrestrial insects, and we need them because they pollinate our plants and they feed other animals all the way up through the food chain. And those animals, right, this whole food chain that we're feeding with plants and insects, both of whom need each other, they're responsible for carbon cycling or stream and water quality or litter decomposition and respiration or soil erosion and cattle right? These things that matter to us, right? Or stopping soil erosion, I should say, right? Are driven by these processes and ecosystems. So we're lucky. We live near one of the largest urban forests in the world, right? This is the Cascades. This is in Melrose. This is part of the Middlesex Fells. And we have an opportunity, right? We have a big island where a lot of these insects can live. Imagine all of our towns without the Middlesex Fells. We would have almost none of those insects. There would be no place to put them. There would be no place for them to live and go through their whole life cycle. We would lose most of our wild birds. We would, right? Cats would eat them and there'd be no place for them to live, right? Habitat loss and transformation of land use is one of the major things driving almost all of the species loss and change in ecosystems that we are experiencing. And we have this beautiful waterfall because we've managed to protect a forest. Yes, please. Thank you. That's amazing. So we have orchids, right, that are able to live all throughout the Middlesex Fells that are so delicate and beautiful. This is just one species out of, I think, 7 or 8 that live in Massachusetts. And by the way, there are more native orchids in Massachusetts than there are in the state of Hawaii. So we have a lot to be proud of. There are these stunning organisms that live in the fells, and we've protected them for us because we like beautiful places to go. But in doing so, we've also protected it for them. And the fells are it's a really interesting island because it's not zero use and it's not zero impact. It's had a whole, range of various things happening throughout its history. But, this is a beautiful photo of a beautiful person, Brian Hamlin, who is a former board member of the Friends of the Fells, and he was part of this huge study scouring the Middlesex Fells for vanished plants and things that people thought were locally extinct hundreds of years ago. He was able to find alive and thriving. And so there's a lot of treasures here. And if you don't care about the fells for the plants, you care about them for these just stunning landscapes, which you can't believe you can find these things, 3 miles from the city of Boston. I mean, it looks like you're in the backwoods of northern Vermont, and yet this is one of the reservoirs, right? So these are beautiful spots. I just feel so lucky that we have all of this in our backyard. I'm sure if you guys haven't spent enough time in the fells yet, this is the time. It's gorgeous. And so what we really have with us is a flourishing urban forest. And yep.
Somebody was asking, where in the Fells is that beautiful stone bridge?
It's in Stoneham, I believe.
It looks like the Virginia woods, isn't it?
I don't remember. That was a picture from our archives. I think it could be Virginia woods. Yeah.
If anybody wants to type into the chat and verify, it looked to me like Virginia wood, but
there's another little bridge up in Stoneham too that's really, really pretty. So I don't know which of the two it is, but it's one. Yeah. How lucky are we that we have more than one? Okay, you're Grimsby, so that's on the Melrose side. Okay, so yeah, perfect. So this flourishing urban forest, right, has a lot to offer, not only us, but everything that lives in it. And it is so close to the city. This is a view from Wright's Tower. I'll try to, when I know where the spots are, I'll try to tell you guys so you guys can know where to go hiking. Okay, so I'm now going to sort of switch gears and tell you sort of my personal story about what we did to my house, where we live right at the edge of Lawrence Woods. And you know, I've made the case before, I hope, right, that what we do in our backyards influences the Fells. And often people love to garden and they have no idea where to start, right? You just want to put something in. And when I bought my house, you know, it looked like every other conventional Dutch colonial in the area, right? It just is what it is. And it had all of those, you know, very neatly sculpted, you know, perfectly shaped balls and of, you know, yew bushes just sitting there doing absolutely nothing that everyone seems to plant all the time for no reason. Sorry if you have them, but you should rip them out and I'll tell you why. But, you know, they just sit there boring. And oh, it had this lovely lawn. The people before me were fastidious in making sure there was not even a single clover living in that thing. They wanted it to be absolutely perfect urban lawn. And there were no animals. And there were no insects, and there were no butterflies, and there were no hummingbirds. And that was just not acceptable to me. So I don't know what the neighborhood thought, but my first 24 hours after signing the papers, we ripped out all of the shrubbery, left, and immediately transformed it to something much more useful, both to me and to the wildlife where we bordered. And that's exactly where those yew bushes were. And now we put in raised beds and had a beautiful vegetable garden, right? And so, and mixed into this are all kinds of plants that we put in for wildlife at the same time, right? This is my house from the front. I mean, can you imagine anything more vanilla? And this is a couple years in, right? You can start to see the garden, what we had started to plant, right? It's slow to take off, but you know, we had this huge mix of all of these native plants that we started to put in, and I'm telling you, within a month of putting them in, we started to have butterflies. And within a year of putting them in, we had basically every butterfly in New England. And then by the third or fourth or fifth year that we were there, we had hummingbirds fighting over our yard, over the prime territory, because we had the most hummingbird plants of anyone in our neighborhood. And we had all the cool beetles. And everyone said, oh my God, but don't you have all these other problems? Because now you have this huge garden, and you know, don't you have insects and other pests eating your vegetable garden? And don't you have mosquitoes all the time? And no, because I had a whole ecosystem that included spiders and bats and all the good stuff. And we had a whole system going. That was great. I really hope the new owners take care of this. So this is, you know, we were on a walking path for one of the walking paths in Medford. And so we put up signs to tell people what we were doing, so that we were the crazy neighbors, but we were the crazy neighbors with a purpose, as opposed to just the crazy neighbors that nobody could understand. Because part of education is you have to tell people what you're doing, or else they don't know why you're doing it. So we put up some signs, and people would walk along the neighborhood and ask us all kinds of questions. You're a wildlife habitat? Wow, you know, do you have something special in your yard? And I'm like, yeah, I put it there, and you guys can too. So you don't need to buy a sign, just so you know. Signs do cost money, but we put one up because we were on a popular walking path. But if you do put up a sign, or you can make a homemade sign if you'd prefer, but the key thing is what you do with your property. And then the signs go with it. So if you want to buy a sign, you go to the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife, and you can figure out how to put up a sign. But the key piece here is what you have to do, right? This is what you do to create a wildlife garden and create this incredible habitat that everything was using. And by the way, those hummingbirds didn't just come out of nowhere. They were coming out of the Fells to my garden and then go back to the Fells and back and forth, right? Same with all the other butterflies and the birds. And the seeds that dispersed from my property, right? The same way the seeds of any other plant that you plant go somewhere, they would get dispersed to the fells. And so we were expanding the fells by planting natives on our property. All right, so there's this downloadable checklist. I'll walk you through what we did just to give you a sense of this, but the main elements are that you're gonna want food, water, cover, places to raise young, and to have sustainable practices. And I will walk you through each little piece. And we will start with food. Okay, so on my property, I had a ton of food. I had seeds, I had berries, I had nectar, I had twigs and fruits and pollen, and I would put out suet for the birds. And I had a bird feeder, which turned out to be a squirrel feeder, but that was fine with me. I like squirrels, but if you don't like squirrels, I don't know if you don't like, how can you not like squirrels? They're so cute. We had nuts. We ended up having we didn't have a hummingbird feeder. We just had hummingbird plants, but of course they fed hummingbirds, right? And so we ended up having all of this stuff. And we had one tree. We had a Bradford pear street tree, and we had I'll show you, one tree, and that's all we had. But in our garden boxes, we put low bush blueberry, which, okay, my kids got about, a third of the blueberries, and the birds took the rest. But that's part of the point, right? To help feed the birds. And there were plenty of insects which were able to nibble on the leaves of those blueberries. Don't get upset if you see that. You should be thrilled. You'd be like, sweet, I set the table and somebody came to eat, right? You're doing your job. And you plant a plant that something else can use. We had cranberries. They're native to New England. So we had cranberries on our property, which look gorgeous in the late fall, by the way. And they vine and they're amazing. We had tons of raspberries. In fact, we could barely keep up with them. And so the birds took all that they wanted, and it was no problem with us because we had everything we wanted in terms of raspberries with plenty left over for wildlife. And I had a typical postage stamp, yard in Medford. It's nothing special, right? So you don't need a lot of property to do this. We had tons of purple coneflower. This is echinacea. Everybody loves it. It sort of has, I guess, medicinal use, and it's just really pretty. But it also is a great nectar source for butterflies. And also all of the goldfinches use it. They love the thistle in the seeds, right? If you ever buy bird seed and buy bird food, it's full of thistle, and it's this stuff. Just plant the flower. Then you get the flower, and you don't have to buy bird seed anymore. You don't even have to put out a bird feeder. You just plant the plant. It's amazing. Nature works. Here you can actually see the goldfinches eating the dead seed heads, after the plants have died off, right? Don't cut back your seed heads, guys. Like, this is where the food is. So, when the flower is blooming, that's where it's food for butterflies and bees. And when it's dead, that's when it becomes food for birds. All right, this whole thing is useful. And then don't cut the stems, because if you leave the stems all winter long, insects have crawled in there to make themselves a cozy little nook all winter long. It protects them from the wind. It protects them from the cold. And then the time to cut your plants down and be a lazy gardener in the fall. The time to cut your plants is about 2 weeks after, things start to really warm up, right? When you start to see insects in the air, then you can go ahead and cut your plants, leave them in a heap for a day or two until everything's had a chance to emerge and leave, and then go compost it. But, until then, let it be. Animals are using that, and it's gold, and you don't have to do a thing. It's awesome. Okay, we had grapes, and they're delicious. And we had tons of nectar and pollen. I love flowers. I love butterflies. And we just had a feast. Constantly. We always had something in bloom, and still do, right? This is just the way we roll. And the trick is to have nectar and pollen available from April through November as a minimum, because that's when most of the insects are out. And so if you think of your garden like a symphony, right? Or as a table that you're trying to set, right? You're going to create this symphony of food and flowers. And so as one flower pops and starts to die, the next one comes up, and then starts to die, and the next one comes up. And it's like fireworks, and it just goes all season long. And it's beautiful, and it's lush, and this is not a prim and proper garden, right? It's a little wild, but our garden hums always, it just buzzes. It's full of life all the time because the insects don't have to leave. They can just park and stay there. And it's really great. So it's a symphony of food and flowers. And, I think about the Fells, like I said, this is my neighborhood. And you think about the Lawrence Estates in Medford, and it's this beautifully landscaped, full of that perfect grass, no clovers, with all of those little yew bushes, and it's a food desert. If you're a butterfly flying around my neighborhood looking for a place to eat, my house was the only game in town for a while, right? Until our neighbor started to do the same thing. And now we had a huge cohort of flowers. But can you just imagine a hungry monarch butterfly, right? Just flying through, it's just come all the way up. It's migrated up from Mexico. And it's made it all the way to New England. And it's just like, give me a flower. I'm starving. And we have all of these yards and we all love butterflies and there is nothing for it to eat, right? What you plant is food for migrating animals that really need it. And if every single person in this map, right, had a yard like mine, can you imagine what that would mean for wildlife in terms of extending the reach of the fells, right? My goal here is crazy gardens, right? Let's do it. So, and this is the flower feast at my house, right? This is what it looks like. This is the hand-picked garden bouquet that I picked last summer, right from my own yard. And you couldn't even tell that I'd taken all these flowers off of the yard, right? This is just what I have on my kitchen table all the time. And we had hand-picked bouquets every 3 to 5 days. We have them in 7 or 8 different places in my house. And everyone's like, oh my goodness, your house is always full of flowers. It must be so expensive. It's like, or I just pick them from my front yard and keep moving, right? This is what it's like to feast if you're an insect at my house. So this would be awesome if we could do this for a whole neighborhoods and have a wildlife food network. I wonder if we can trademark that, but a wildlife food network where, you know, if you're a bird or an insect, everywhere you go, you have a place to land and a place to lay your eggs. And, you know, when I think about this, like setting the table, right? When I set the table at my house, everybody comes to feast, right? I'm a Jewish mama. I love to feed people. It's in my DNA. It's what I do. And I want to do it for plants and insects too. And there's no trade-off, right? There's no downside. It's not like you have to plant all the ugly plants that nobody wants. Like that's what the world's already done that, right? We've planted a million ugly yew bushes just sitting there like little balls, useless. Instead, you could have this, right? This is the cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis. And this is what happens when you plant it. No joke. Every day we had hummingbirds fighting for access to our house. Trumpet flower, gorgeous. Yes, some people say, oh no, it's toxic. Yeah, okay, so don't eat it. Lots of things are toxic. Your yew bushes, by the way, are incredibly poisonous. You eat them, you will probably die. If you eat this, you will probably die, but your yew bushes do nothing for wildlife. And instead they have those beautiful little berries that kids want to eat. This, no kid is going to try to pick it because it's going to be buzzing with insects and hummingbirds, which are going to use it all the time, right? So don't be scared of plants that are toxic. You already have plants that are toxic. You just don't know it. That's the key. The native honeysuckle, another hummingbird plant that you guys can have, Linicera sempervirens. It grows natively in the fells. I see it all the time. People also, there's also tons of that Japanese honeysuckle in the fells all the time. And Japanese honeysuckle is terrible for the environment. Yes, it is a little bit of a nectar source, which is how it spreads, right? Birds will eat it and spread its seed, but it does nothing for local insects in terms of a nesting or a place to lay eggs and eat. Or if you're a caterpillar nothing can eat its leaves if you're the Japanese honeysuckle. And it crowds everything else out. And Japanese honeysuckle is really humid in its interior, which creates the perfect environment for ticks to overwinter. Get rid of Japanese honeysuckle and plant our native instead. It's red and yellow, and it'll bring you hummingbirds and joy and no ticks. I just don't see the downside.
Hey, Randi.
Yeah.
We had another question. Do you have a plant list from your house in Medford?
I do. In fact, if you want, I will, if you fill out that form that you put, I'll just put that in, I'll put that in an email list. I'll send you guys our whole plant list. And it's organized by sun and shade and wet and dry, so you guys can figure out where to plant that.
Perfect.
Okay. A couple more things, and then I will, I don't want to give you so much plant and insect porn here, but I just love these, what you can do in your own yard, right? You can get swallowtails, which, you know, and all the butterflies that everyone loves to see, but then if you get in the habit of just sitting and watching your garden for a minute, you'll see the things that nobody else sees, right? Like this little insect, which is parked on a black-eyed Susan, and happens to be a sit and wait predator, and will eat all my houseflies. I was wondering why we had a total decrease in houseflies. They really weren't bugging us when we went outside to have a picnic or eat in our backyard porch. And it's because we had these sit and wait predators everywhere catching all the houseflies. We had a whole ecosystem going on. You can get some pretty rare butterflies coming through. This is on Coreopsis. This is tick seed. Some beautiful little leaf hoppers, but these are teeny tiny, right? You have to sit and look, but there's like a whole safari going on in your backyard. all the time once you plant it. All right, next piece, water. We put in a little fountain. We did this for two reasons. We did it because it was a bit of a bird bath. We did it because there were 4 spigots coming out and I have little kids and they could play in the fountain and make giant mud piles, which I totally encouraged. And so we had this very gorgeous looking fountain that we completely muddied up, but it fed a lot of wildlife, right? Wildlife need, especially in those drought periods, you need water. We had rain gardens and we had, and we have them now still too, where we are. I'm in the process of doing all of this again. And we have tons of cover, right? As you let your garden and your yard rewild a little bit, you get some, I mean, we have a lot of chipmunks this year, but you can get chipmunks and you get wild turkeys and places for birds to nest. And if you put up birdhouses, you'll see them come in. This is another gorgeous, by the way, evergreen shrub that provides a ton of cover and these beautiful cotton candy pink flowers right around now. This is Kalmia latifolia. This is mountain laurel. Also toxic, don't eat it. But again, you live with it all the time. Most things are. And it provides this beautiful dense shrubbery that we've had hundreds of birds nesting in over the years. And you know what? It's an evergreen. So it's beautiful in the winter too. You know, these plants don't have to be ugly when they go away. They're just as beautiful, if not way more so than that silly little yew bush. You can get inkberry, and this is another evergreen, which also looks beautiful in the winter and provides these really important berries that a lot of birds really use, right? A lot of you have rhododendrons, really useful, lots of cover, as well as beautiful flowers. They're blooming now. This is a cardinal using this plant in the winter, right? And so you can see how important these plants can be as cover. In fact, my whole garden, even though it was basically died back, still looked really good in the winter, right? Because if you just leave things up, you can sort of see these sticky little stems in the bottom. You know, I know that there's insects overwintering in there. So the cover that you plant is really important. Places to raise young. Mature trees, nesting boxes, dense shrubs and thickets, you know, that stuff's not always possible in sort of the urban wilds that surround the fells, but we had one real tree. We had a pin oak, and you know, that was enough. There was a lot of habitat. Doug Tallamy, who's sort of way more of an expert on this than I, says you can only plant one real tree, plant an oak. It will support 534 butterfly and moth species from that one tree alone, right? But think about it. I had oak, and I had cranberry, and I had blueberry, and that's all I had on this list. But together, that's almost 1,000 species of different insects supported, right? And not even insects, butterflies and moths exclusively supported with those 3 species alone. All right. So planting host plants is really important, right? Trying to think about who's going to eat your plants. And no, they're not going to eat it to the ground. They're going to take a few nibbles of your leaves. And when you see that, again, you should celebrate it because you know that something's using your plants, right? Which means that you're able to foster more insects and more native wildlife in the world, which is great. You know, these are monarch caterpillars that are using milkweed. And these have been in decline, right? Their populations have been fluctuating. It's sort of an iconic North American species that everyone's trying to save. And you can save it by having a lot of it in your backyard, right? Or front yard, or side yard, or roof deck, or front porch if you plant a milkweed in a pot. You know, you can do this any way you want, and you can become a monarch way station. And it's really fun. You can, you know, put little tags on butterflies, and somebody will count them when they go to Mexico, and you can see, you know, how much of these butterflies and how much of this population is using your yard. So again, no trade-off in beauty here, right? This is the butterfly milkweed. This is one of the species of, there's like almost, I think there's over a dozen milkweed species, and they're all beautiful and different. And I mean, this thing will grow in the hottest, driest, most arid, terrible soil that you have. This plant loves. So we know, just because you think, oh God, I don't know, my soil isn't great. You know, your soil is not great for this plant, but it might be really good for this one. So it's all about just sort of knowing which plants you need. And it's gorgeous. Okay. Another milkweed. This is our common milkweed. And it's really beautiful when you look up close. Same with swamp. Just to give you guys a sense of, you know, the smorgasbord of color that you can get just by planting, just because if you like monarch butterflies, this is what their caterpillars need to eat, right? And milkweed seeds are way more fun to blow than dandelion seeds. You can just stand there and whiff these little tufts. In fact, you can, they're all kind of, people are very creative. You you're into the zombie apocalypse pandemic planning, you can, stuff a pillow with these or line them with the coat. You can use them as down. So there you go. All right, sustainable practices are really important, and then I'll wrap up here. But thinking about soil and water conservation is really important, and controlling invasive species, and thinking about what you can do to keep everything sort of sustainable. This tower in the middle is called the garden tower. It has a vermicompost in the center. We had worms. We would take all of our compost, put it in the middle, pull out the compost tea right in our garden, and we would just pour it right back in the garden boxes. And we have a whole little self-rotating system. And this is all in a postage stamp yard again, but this is how you do it. We put insect hotels up and left our old woody stems, right? Like I've mentioned, and that can do a lot to give insects a safe place to overwinter. If you cut your plants in the fall and you put them in yard waste bags and you let the cities take them away, you are throwing out all of your insects. Wait until the spring, then do that. And after the insects have hatched out. A couple of years ago, we had that terrible drought and everybody's yard was brown. Mine was green and flourishing because we had rain barrels and we never ran out of water. We had 3 of them. And everyone says, oh, but rain barrels are so ugly. Yeah. Can you see my rain barrel? Can you see it now? You can hide them and they don't have to be ugly. And we never feel drought in our house, right? We let rain collect in these rain barrels. It comes off of the gutter, off of our roofs. And when there are, bans on watering, we always have tons of water. And the other thing about native plants is you barely need to water them. You water them just to establish them, and then they can handle the climate of New England. So using native plants has a lot of benefits, and they're beautiful. So again, just a little bit of, just to showcase what's possible. But for every ornamental plant that they want to sell you at Home Depot or even Mahoney's, right? There is a native alternative that is just gorgeous, and they smell terrific, and they do a whole lot for native wildlife. And so you can use native plants, and they will help. They will help control invasives, and they will help provide food for wildlife. So this is one of the biggest movements out there is to control American lawns. This is my preferred lawn. This is my ideal lawn. It's full of bluets. It's beautiful, or clover, or anything that can also provide a pollen source. I see there's a question which says, is there a good source of native plants? Yep. Garden in the Woods in Framingham actually is a great source. It's exclusively natives, but even Mahoney's has a whole native section. If you know how to ask for it, then you can go down there, and everything in that section is a native plant, and they're great. And so, yep, you can, there's a ton of stuff out there.
There's also a question about the rain barrels, Randi. Where did you get those?
I think it depends on where you live. So a lot of cities will actually offer rain barrel programs where they'll offer them to you discounted. I wanted them at a different time than my city was offering them at the time. So I literally just went on to Craigslist and said, hey, who's got a rain barrel? And I just drove around and I picked up 3 in one day. And I think it cost me less than $100 and I had 3 rain barrels, right? So you can go find them. And then I think one of them wasn't a real rain barrel. It was just a barrel, and we had to buy some hardware and, put a spigot in. And you want the top, if you're going to do that, to be screened so mosquito larvae can't breed in it. Okay. How do you establish bluets? Yeah, you can they'll basically spread themselves. If you, you can either buy seed, or you can buy 2 plants if you're going to buy sort of a starter plant so that they can cross-pollinate. And they spread, if they're happy, they'll spread pretty quickly. Or clovers, right? Clovers are great. Or dandelions, even though they're not native, have a place, right? They're really important nectar sources for bees in the early spring. So, it's really funny. I had a friend on Facebook who said, oh my God, I'm failing as a suburbanite. My lawn is full of weeds. And I was like, oh my God, that's a success story. So just shift your thinking. All right, I'm going over time, but Japanese knotweed, black swallowwort, garlic mustard, and oriental bittersweet are 4 plants that are evil, and you should know about them. There's a couple more too, but if you have these plants, get rid of them. And don't think of them as plants. Think of them as forest killers, poison for butterflies, a tricky plant that tricks and kills native butterflies, and an oriental bittersweet chokes trees to death. Once you understand what these invasives do, you'll never allow them in your yard again. And I'm not talking about an easy battle here, right? It's a war, not a single battle. You are going to have to pull these things again and again and again. But if you like putzing around in your garden, gives you something to do, because native plants, once they're established, are really easy. You don't have much to do. So pulling invasives keep you busy. And it's like the most important thing you can do, because these invasives are so good at their job of killing forests and poisoning wildlife and choking trees to death and invading the fells, that if you don't control them in your yard, they are going to get into the forest, right? This is where these plants come from. So what you do in your yard in terms of planting natives, that brings good seeds back to the forest. And if you let these invasives grow and go to seed, it's going to put bad seeds in the forest. And the forest is fighting. And it's an island, right? There's no place for it to expand to or to retreat to. It is what it is, and there's no extra space for it. When I say chokes trees to death, I mean chokes trees to death, right? This thing goes all the way up to the top. And you can see this beautiful white pine is now full of bittersweet with no opportunity to photosynthesize. Japanese barberry, another evil enemy of yours and mine. This stuff is thorny. People plant it all the time. It's still for sale in most nurseries around here as an ornamental yard plant. There should be a law against being able to buy this stuff. This stuff, not only is it useless for wildlife, but it is a tick magnet. This is the #1 plant that is fostering the ability of ticks to be able to overwinter, because it's the same thing with the Japanese honeysuckle, right? But this plant is even worse. The humidity inside is just perfect all winter long, and ticks love this stuff. And so do small mice, which are also harboring ticks. And so getting rid of this plant can go a long way to helping our tick population. I pulled, in our new property, we had over 150 Japanese barberry plants, which I've pulled and burned this spring, up in flames, as it should be. And finally, in your lawn, people strive for the perfect lawn. I've talked about this before, but if you don't want to do it for the bees and the butterflies, do it for your soil and your water. This is the root system of most Kentucky bluegrass, which is generally what you have in your lawn, or most lawn grasses. This is the extent of the root system. That's all you get. It's not turbating your soil. It's not enriching it. It's not providing substrate for microbes and fostering good soil health, or preventing soil erosion, or helping to filter water. It's just sitting at the surface like a mat of uselessness compared to all of the native plants that you can have instead, which will do so much more for you. So if you have a little space that you're like, I want more space to garden in, but all I have is lawn, till a little bit of your lawn and plant all of this other stuff, right? You have a lot of power if you just sort of open your eyes to what's there. And again, even if you were to plant like daylilies and aspirea, which are really common plants, I mean, they're better than grass, but if you were to plant their equivalents, their native equivalents, you can do even more, right? Look at what ninebark can do, or black-eyed Susans, right? These plants have power, and all you have to do is plant them, and then they take care of themselves and do all the things, right? So my idea of a perfect lawn, if you don't like bluets, you can switch to Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. You can even mow this stuff 3 or 4 times a year. It'll look like a conventional lawn, but it does more for wildlife, and its roots are much deeper. So for anything that you can think of, there is a native alternative that will do the same thing but better. And I learned this lesson from Dan Jaffe, who was the former curator at Garden in the Woods, who really showed me how you could pair each plant. And finally, for organic practices, don't use pesticides. It's terrible. It's going to kill all the wildlife that you are trying to promote. A single pesticide application will kill off a lot of it. And if you have a problem insect, you can kill it with boiling water. You can kill it with a dilute vinegar mix. You can kill it with a dilute lemon juice mix, right? There's lots of ways to have organic practices, even if you're hell-bent on getting rid of the anthill, which I say let ants live, but if you don't want them, fine, right? Just pour boiling water on their anthill and you don't have to use a single chemical. Because when you pour chemicals in your lawn on a day like today, they drain to storm drains and they end up in my ocean, and they end up in your ocean, and they kill our rivers. And there's a whole lot of other problems. And if you won't do it for wildlife, do it for yourself. It's controversial in many ways, but the evidence is stacking up in 18 million different ways that there's a lot of different types of cancer associated with these pesticides. And it's diffuse, so it's not that easy, right? You don't spray the pesticide one day and come down with cancer the next. It happens over a lifetime, but limiting our exposure to this stuff is really important. And different pesticides affect human health in different ways, so I don't want to give you I'm not a doctor and I don't want to give you like, oh, if you use this pesticide versus this one. I just say, just eliminate them all. You don't need them. And it'll be better for your yard and for you and my kids who are going to sit and play in anybody's yard, anywhere they are. Okay, so we all live here. What you do in your yard, you think, it's just my little postage stamp yard. I don't even have a yard. I have a roof deck. I don't even have a roof deck. I have a front porch. I don't even have a front porch. I have front steps. But if you put a pot, a potted plant on your front steps, and it happens to be a native one that can capture more rain and feed a butterfly and, doesn't have pesticides on it, you are doing more for the planet, right, than the person next to you who's all concrete. You can do something, right, as a single individual. And if every individual acts together, think about this watershed, right? If you live in the Mississippi River watershed, you think, well, I don't affect the ocean, until you look at this view of the world, and then you realize that you do. And so I hope that you guys will feel really empowered to get into your gardens and dig up the stuff that doesn't belong there and try to replace it with something that it does, and appreciate its beauty. Because forests, flowers, pollinators, oceans, people, we all benefit from those small choices that you make. They're not small choices, actually. They feel small, but they're really big. And the whole entire planet benefits too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Randi. That was great information. Loved it. Do we have any questions for Randi? So much good information. I loved your concept of kind of like blurring the edges between where the forest is and where all of our lawns start. And if we can use more native plants, we're actually kind of blurring the edge and kind of expanding the forest, and we're expanding the habitat value.
Yeah, the edge is already blurred. It's just blurred in the wrong direction, right? We're planting all this terrible stuff, and that stuff is invading the fells, and we can 100% reverse that with nothing more elegant than just replanting your house. I love that. So thanks, Chris.
Yeah, that's great.
Are there any? I see there's a couple other questions. Oh no, we got them all. Oh, good. Somebody put gronativesmass.org. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any, if people have ideas for additional information on this topic that you'd like us to provide to you, or that we can help you find out about, you could put it in the chat now and we could talk about it. Or we can also just get it via the form from you, and then we can follow up with you. But we'd love to help you make this wonderful vision that Randi has laid out for us a reality for you if you'd like to do it. So we're here to help if we can. So
I'll definitely send out, if you fill out that form, I'll definitely send you my plant list, and we can send you a native plant brochure. And it just, don't get overwhelmed. Once you start just planting one thing, it's all it takes. And then you'll just notice the next one, and then the next one. All of this information doesn't come all at once. Just start somewhere, and it'll just start to snowball for you. So don't get overwhelmed.